Terrible news. Two British men and a Moroccan national captured whilst fighting in the Ukrainian army. I'm going to emphasise that because it will become important during the course of this discussion. They were captured whilst fighting in the Ukrainian army in Mariupol, have been sentenced to death by pro-Russia officials after a day-long process described as a disgusting Soviet-era show trial. I second that. That's precisely what it was. The court in Russian-controlled East Ukraine convicted 28-year-old Aidan Aslin from Newark and 48-year-old Sean Pinner from Watford and Saudin Brahman on charges of terrorism. And I use that in inverted commas. But both Britons have said they were serving in the Ukrainian Marines, making them active duty soldiers who should be protected by the Geneva Conventions on Prisoners of War, which knowing quite a great deal about this, Russia are obliged to obey. Here to give us his thoughts is former British Army Colonel Ash Alexander Cooper, OBE. Firstly, Colonel Ash Alexander Cooper, thank you for your service and thank you for being here to talk to us today. Just to be clear, a lot of people don't necessarily understand that even in the course of a war, even an illegal invasion like Vladimir Putin's in Ukraine, that there are international obligations when it comes to taking prisoners, and they apply to Russia. Can you help us explain, or can you help us understand them?
Yes, so the laws of armed conflict are very well laid out and explicitly clear for anybody who chooses to read them about what is expected of the troops, if you are the belligerent force or otherwise, the conduct on both sides that is expected as per international law and international norms. Further to that, the categorization of what constitutes a combatant or a mercenary or anything else is, again, equally clear. And in this case, Russia's claims that both of these Brits were mercenaries is categorically untrue. If one is to look at that particular rule or law, it states that to be a mercenary, you have to have been specifically recruited for financial gain, to have no connection with the state involved in the conflict, and not be a member of any organised armed force. Well, one of them has a fiancé, I believe. One is married to Ukrainian. They've lived there for 4 years. They are members of the Ukrainian army. I mean, it's clear that this is just a false narrative being used for propaganda terms. Yeah,
I have to say, I've looked at this also in detail and have done several cases which touch on this issue in the past. And I think even frankly, the mercenary description, in other words, even if they had been paid by outside organisations, the convention would still apply. But, that's a discussion for you and me and another occasion. One of the terrifying things we find ourselves in now is that they are facing a death sentence and nobody really understands the appeal process. In other words, whether or not they're being, as I think a lot of people assume, following Lynn Truss's condemnation, used as some sort of political bargaining chip, sort of de facto hostages, or whether or not this particular armed militia, described as a breakout or break-off group of Russia, as if they're not under control of the auspices of Vladimir Putin, are going to do what they say and carry out a firing squad. It's difficult to know. What's your instinct?
Well, the language they've used is very clever in a way that if Russia chooses to distance itself from them, then they can do so. But clearly they are working in accordance with the direction given from Moscow. I think the challenge we have is that we are applying Western liberal democracy logic and the fact that we do follow international norms, rules and regulations, etc. And we are working with somebody here who clearly doesn't, or a state that doesn't care, and therefore assuming how they might act in any given situation is likely to end with an incorrect result or assumption.
I have to say, Colonel Ash Alexander Cooper, you look at the history of Russia, again, a real personal fascination of mine. They've never really abided by the Geneva Convention in any war that they've been engaged in, whether or not that's in Afghanistan or Chechnya or earlier on. I mean, this is the culmination of us having appeased Putin over a period of a decade. I'm trying to think back historically when, despite their overtures to being signatories to the convention and obeying international norms, that Russia ever had. Can you think of an example?
I'm not a historian to be able to cast my mind back all the way, but in certainly looking at the last two major sort of theatres of conflict, let's say of Syria and Chechnya, where they employed exactly the same tactics as we're seeing today, we should not be surprised that this is their modus operandi.
Right.
Again, in terms of what is forbidden in international law in conflict, you're not to attack villages, dwellings, or buildings. You're not to deliberately target civilian objects, commit pillage, to starve civilians, or destroy infrastructure or things that are key to the survival of populations. All of these things we are seeing daily being done, and it's hard to know quite how we hold them to account.
And I think that's, if I may say, a very elegant segue into that discussion. It's all very well for us to sit here in the safety of my studio, and unlike you, who have put your life on the line by serving in our armed forces, which we thank you for, the reality is somebody needs to be held to account. And breach after breach of international law, I'm absolutely convinced myself, as many people are, that these are acts, or have been acts of genocide already, certainly in eastern Ukraine. I heard some of that evidence myself when I was on the border. Given that's the case, how realistic is it for Vladimir Putin or any of these commanders to be held to account?
Well, I think we've already accepted that the chances of those who have returned to Russia or are safely in Russia who may be directing this activity and this behavior, the chances of them being brought to account is very, very slim, unless they happen to find themselves out of the country and were arrested and taken to The Hague, let's say. I think we have to accept that, unfortunately, that it's going to be extremely tough, but we can't allow this kind of behavior to continue. But it's a wicked problem. How do we apply our own laws and the ways in which we would consider is the right kind of statecraft, or how states should behave, when this state is acting more like a terrorist organization? I mean, if I was captured in many of these theaters, if it was against a state, one would expect to be treated in the way that we would treat prisoners in the same way, but they're acting much more like a terrorist organization.
I mean, I couldn't have put it any better, and I hope that's clipped up, and I'm going to ask it is. I think you're exactly right. The question is, what's the best political strategic approach to get our citizens back, or to have these prisoners released? And it's a tough old quandary, both for the Foreign Office and for the Department of Defense. If you were advising and in that room, what would you be saying?
It's really tough. I mean, I think that I'd frame it in a slightly different way, that the biggest risk is the exploitation by Russia of any cracks or weakness that they perceive in the coalition. The more unified we can be for as long as possible, that's the thing that Ukraine needs, to see that the world is behind it. The moment Russia sees any divergence of opinion or approach or weakening of any position, has already started happening in Europe, that is going to be much more dangerous, not just for these two, but for anyone else who may be captured in the future by them.
Can we just end on that? Macron's statement, I listen to it in French and speak Russian. I have to say, and I'm trying to listening to Russian news as far as you can find it, but when he said we shouldn't humiliate Russia, that was not translated across the Russian news networks in a benign way. It was a significant victory, it seemed, for Russian propaganda. What do you think it did for the unity of the response to Russia?
Well, it's clearly there are fractures starting to happen, and we just need to be really mindful of that, because every single one will be exploited. And we do understand that, Russia, a wounded bear will lash out, and some of those things may just be a necessary part of this process. Right. We can't weaken or our resolve be diminished just because we start to see them reacting. But the unification, or the unified position, is the thing that's going to matter most, I believe, from this sort of now on in.
Yeah, well, that was Colonel Ash Alexander Cooper, OBE, former British Army Colonel. Thank you so much for your insight. This is Rob Rinder, live from the Talk Radio studio